Okay, welcome back. It's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce Bob twice in 2 days. One thing I didn't mention in Jason has just reminded me that I should interrupt the pleasure of introducing Bob for the second time to ask you who's coming to dinner tonight. If you'd like to come along to dinner tonight, could you raise your hands, please? Okay. What I was about to say was that I just wanted to repeat something that Paul actually mentioned in his comments after Bob's talk last night. I mean, as Paul reminded us, Bob is actually here on holiday, and so we're particularly privileged, I think, that he's been prepared to give up this amount of time to take part in this workshop and to give us the lecture tonight. So now I'm delighted to introduce him to speak to us on Kantian lessons about mind, meaning, and rationality. Okay.
Those of you who were here last night will recognize at various points that I'm going to be traversing some of the same territory that I did last night, coming from different directions. I mean, there's central landmarks you may well recognize. I think some of these different directions, different contexts I'll put it in, are worthwhile, but you'll still recognize the big landmarks of my view. Kant revolutionized our thinking about what it is to have a mind, but I think that what seemed to me some of his most important points typically don't get recognized. And I think that's because they have to do with what he does rather than with what he says about what he's doing. He has a particular way of pitching his project, and there's certainly a good reason for him to do it that way. But I think some of the most important points that he makes, some of the most important philosophical moves that he makes, happen before the first page of the first critique. They're things that he's taking for granted in the way he proceeds and doesn't thematize, doesn't tell us about. So I'm going to be extracting those lessons sort of from the general shape of his view rather than from particular things that he said. Descartes notoriously gave philosophical thought about the mind an epistemological turn by distinguishing between minds and bodies, the two main flavors of things, in terms of the epistemic transparency and incorrigibility of the mental, the immunity of mental things respectively to ignorance and error, thinking of the rest of the world as the things we could be ignorant about or in error about. The fact that thoughts could misrepresent their objects or represent them incompletely meant that our knowledge of the merely represented world was fallible and incomplete. But on pain of an infinite regress, he thought, those thoughts must themselves be thought of as known immediately, by being had rather than by being represented in turn, which was the cause of their privileged epistemic status. Still, at the most basic level, I think Descartes just takes it for granted that the world comes in these two flavors, stuff that by nature represents and stuff that by nature is represented. And the representing stuff he thought of as intrinsically tanquam rem, as if of things. The question he focuses on is what reason we have to think that things are in fact as we represent them to be. His fundamental problematic is accordingly to explain the possibility of knowledge, of beliefs about things outside the mind that are both true and justified. How could we know that things really are as they appear to us? How could we justify that claim? By contrast, Kant gives philosophical thought about the mind a semantic turn by shifting the center of attention from truth and justification to the nature of representation itself. He replaces concern with justifying claims to representational success by concern with understanding representational purport. His problem isn't in the first instance showing that reality at least often is as it appears to us, but understanding what it is for things so much as to appear to be, one way rather than another. He wants to know what it is for mental states to be or to appear to us to be, to function as representings of represented objects. Kant sees that the epistemological question has semantic presuppositions, and the issue for him is not knowledge, but intentionality. You could think of each of those projects as responding to the threat of a kind of skepticism, but if so, Kant's skepticism, the one he's worried about, isn't epistemological skepticism, it's semantic skepticism. The idea that it might not, in the end, be fully intelligible to us, that things should even appear to us to be one way rather than another. In asking this question about the nature of intentionality, Kant moves to an issue that's clearly conceptually prior to the one that's central for Descartes. And this sort of move isn't merely of historical interest. The principal argument of Seller's masterwork, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, is that the soft underbelly of both traditional and logical empiricism is their implicit semantics. He saw that broadly Cartesian foundationalism depends on there being a semantically autonomous stratum of thought, something that's given, epistemologically to be sure, but more fundamentally semantically given. And it's the semantic givenness that Sellers ultimately takes issue with. That is, Sellers offers Kantian semantic arguments against the epistemological myth of the given. More specifically, Sellers argues that there can't be an autonomous language game, one that one plays though one plays no other, that consists entirely of making non-inferential reports. Unless some claims can be made as the result of inferences, none of them can count as conceptually contentful, in the sense that's required for them even potentially to offer evidence or justification for further conclusions. That is, he argues in effect that nothing that can't serve as the conclusion of an inference can serve as the premise of one either. We'll see further along that this too is a Kantian theme. But for now, I'm not concerned to say why we might think Sellers is right about this, though I think he is, only that he's recognizably following up on Kant's response to Descartes. So far I've said that Kant points out that before one worries about whether or under what circumstances mental representation is or could be known to be generically successful, one has to think hard about what it is for something to be taken or treated as, to have the practical or functional significance of a representation at all. In classical epistemological terms, you have to understand what it is to believe that things are thus and so, in order then to try to understand what it is for such a belief to be true or justified. But in fact, Kant commits himself to something much stronger than this. He thinks that any adequate answer to the possible semantic skeptic will also be an adequate answer to the epistemological skeptic. Satisfying the conditions under which there can be representings at all will settle it, he thinks, that some, indeed many of them, must be true. This is the ultimate idea behind his refutation of idealism. Once you've seen what's presupposed by representational purport, you'll see that it includes a substantial degree of representational success. Unless we're to a large extent right about how things are, we can't make sense of our being wrong, even in special cases. This, I think, is an exceptionally bold claim, and once again it's been echoed and developed in our own times. Here we can think of Davidson's principle of charity based on his interpretivist semantic methodology, and the lesson that Putnam draws from his thought experiment about brains in vats. Again, an argument along these lines may or may not work, but Kant's idea that one could show on semantic grounds that we have sufficient reason to reject global epistemological skepticism about the truth and justification of our beliefs in general is a deep and radically original one, and people are still trying to make something like that work. So, on top of Kant's semantic transformation of philosophical problematics from epistemological to semantic, he builds a semantic explanatory aspiration that resolving the semantic problematic would resolve the epistemological one. The thought that's ultimately driving Kant here is the importance of distinguishing between what Frege calls force and content. This is the distinction between what one is doing in endorsing a claim, taking it to be true, whether internally in judging or externally in asserting, on the one hand, and the content that one thereby endorses on the other. That is, I want to claim that Kant's practice depends on distinguishing between the two sides of what Sellers called the notorious ing-ed ambiguity, between judgment as the act of judging and as the content judged. This is a distinction of cardinal importance, for instance, in sorting out Berkeley's confusion